Good evening. I'm Stephen Henry Madoff. I'm the chair of the MA Curatorial Practice program at the School of Visual Arts in New York. The program is a 2-year degree training young curators in every aspect of the field. And it's a pleasure to welcome Kate Fowle as our inaugural lecturer in the annual Distinguished Global Curator Lecture Series. As many of you know, Kate is in the midst of a remarkable career that includes her recent directorship of MoMA PS1, her position as chief curator and artistic director at Garage Museum of Contemporary Art in Moscow, her work as executive director of ICI, Independent Curators International, and the inaugural international curator at the Ullens Center for Contemporary Art in Beijing. Kate co-founded the master's program in curatorial practice at the California College of the Arts. So that's something that she and I share, with no doubt many scars on our backs. And she in fact co-founded the commercial art gallery in London, Smith & Fowle, and began her art life, it seems, training as an artist at the Norwich School of Art and Design, which I suppose circles back to her subject tonight, concerning her thoughts about how a curator or cultural institution can be truly and rigorously artist-centered. So, welcome, Kate.
Thank you, Stephen. And I'd like to say thank you to Brian, who is the maestro of this evening, and also to Ree McBride, who I'm not sure if she's here, but she's been the person that's been working behind the scenes to make all of this happen. And it was very good to meet with the students this afternoon. I'm glad to see that some of you have made it for round 2 of this conversation, and to see other people in the audience that I know and some that I don't. So it's fantastic to be here. And it's the first time that I've been called distinguished, a real honor. I hope it doesn't mean long in the tooth, but it's great.
And it won't be the last time either.
I also want to say a big congratulations to Brian Conwood, who today it was announced is the co-curator of the next Taipei Biennial. So excited to see what you'll do in September next year with that. So this is the first time I've presented on this topic, thinking through what artist-centered practices actually mean as a curator and with institutions. It's not, however, the first time that I've been thinking about it. It's something that is the thread that I understand to be running through the entirety of my career. So it's been really good to have this opportunity to start to try and think in a straight line and in a concise enough way to be able to present to you. And I look forward to any and all feedback after I've finished presenting. So I will be showing you some slides, but first of all, what I'd like to do is read a short kind of statement by way of an introduction, so that at least you have something that's comprehensible to kind of outline what it is that I've been thinking about. So I apologize, I still have not worked out a way on a laptop to read and look into the screen at the same time as having a piece of paper below me. So artists have long worked at the intersection of the social, cultural, environmental, and political urgencies of their times to critique and challenge the status quo. Their perspectives can repeatedly change and influence how we see and experience the world. They show us the ineffable. They spur conversations we may otherwise never have. Materially and conceptually, they ascribe connections and create juxtapositions that get us to rethink what we think we know. Their work can also just change our mood, give us joy. Artists and the art they make can create headspace when we need it. That's why we go to see shows, go to talks, to performances, right? If we have a job of any kind in proximity to an art institution, from maintenance to curatorial, development to operations, visitor engagement to accountant, guest curator to trustee, then we are being paid by and working within an infrastructure that exists and perpetuates because of artists and art. We place importance and relevance on the institutions that make art public, that enable the production and circulation of art. We're willing to fight for their existence, to labor to make them function and grow, to call out what makes them lag. But how often does the source of our ecosystem's existence, artists and art, somehow get lost in the fray of getting institutions to function, of pursuing our own curatorial communications or development agendas. What does it really mean to be artist-centered or artist-driven or artist-oriented, as are some of the other turns of phrase that you hear? As a curator or as someone working in a cultural institution, it's, I think, a big question. What is it to put what artists do at the heart of our practice? What is it to put artist relationships, in other words, human relationships, first? I have spent 28 years thinking through and around these questions while working in very diverse and different places and positions. The only three firm conclusions I have come to are these. The old adage, systems don't change systems, people do, makes sense to me. That being artist-centered is a choice that each of us can make in our practice. And lastly, that the process is necessarily iterative. Therefore, it is something that will need continuous reflection and awareness. So this presentation, as a mirror of my own practice, is a work in progress. So I'm just going to share my screen, hopefully with no hitches. So this talk isn't going to be biographical, but I'm going to start with this one slide that is, because I thought it would be useful to talk to you a little bit about some of the first ways that I started working, because they are, or the experiences that I had through them are basically the starting point to how I started thinking about the foundational tenets of what it is to be artist-centered in your practice. So when I first started working, I worked in collaboration with Deborah Smith under the name of Smith and Fowle. If we failed in our enterprise, we thought we could be private detectives. And basically, we worked out of an office in the East End of London. It wasn't actually commercial, Stephen. In fact, it was quite the opposite. It made no money. But basically, what we did was we worked with artists to put money into their hands. In other words, we will be developing new projects with them. We will be commissioning them where possible. And we'd be working between institutions and the artists. In other words, part of the kind of gig economy. So we would be commissioned by an institution. It could be a nonprofit or it could be a museum to develop a project that would involve us commissioning artists. And through this, what I started to understand was the trust that is necessary, the trust that you need to build with an artist if you are going to be the bridge between them and an institution. And I think that's something that is really important. When I moved to the United States, I first moved to San Francisco, and that's when I set up the Curatorial Practice program at the California College of Arts with Ralph Rugoff, who was the co-chair. And that was the first time the term curatorial practice had actually been used. It was the first curating program that was in an art school. It was the second in the country at the time. This was in 2002. And the reason why I chose to use the word practice when I was outlining the whole program was because I was thinking about it very much in line with an artist practice, i.e., it's a practice that you need to develop over time, that is durational, that is iterative, and that needs to be responsive to the situations and the context that you're developing it within. And this actually stood me in good stead for when I was the director of ICI, Independent Curators International, because that was a moment when I was having to think through what is it to work with curators in different places around the world, a lot of the time outside of main art centers, and how to support them in thinking through platforms whereby artists' voices could be heard in different places. At the same time as working for CCA, I developed a project called The Back Room in collaboration with Magali Ariola and Renaud Proche. And this was a completely independent project. And it started off in Culver City, which many of you will know now is once again the kind of one of the centers in LA for commercial art galleries like Blum and Poe, etc. At the time that we were setting up the Back Room, we actually did it in what is now the Mandrake Bar. And the artists who were setting up the Mandrake Bar wanted to have it open. So Magali, Renaud, and I decided we were going to do a project with money coming out of our pockets. And we wanted to focus on what artists were interested in. We wanted to use it as a way to research and work with artists to find out what they were thinking about, what their influences were. So this project actually ended up going from 2005 to 2010. There were 9 different versions of it. It started off 6 months in Culver City, and the artists would be added into it every other week. It ended up becoming like a project within other exhibitions. And all the time, it was basically presenting the research materials or the ideas or the concepts that artists thought were important to their own practice. And interestingly, the last time we did it was at PS1 during Greater New York in 2010. So that was a kind of preemptive to my future history at that time. When I moved to China to work at the Ullens Center for contemporary art, this was another whole different way of starting to experience and think through what it meant to be artist-centered, because I had to really focus on understanding a context that was quite outside of anything that I was used to. And more importantly, trying to learn from and listen to artists and their needs. Because when you're working in a situation as the Ullens Center was at the time, now called UCCA, it was basically the first contemporary art space in China. And so we had a twofold conundrum to get through. The first was understanding the fact that audiences, which came in their forces, weren't necessarily used to seeing contemporary art. So how do you start to think about putting artists' ideas forward in the best possible way? And artists also weren't used to presenting work in this kind of framework. It was a new kind of framework. So how do you support and facilitate them best for working in this kind of environment? So just to summarize, I've kind of made a list of foundational ideas that came out of this beginning thinking that I think you'll hear in different modes throughout the rest of the talk. So in terms of thinking about what it is to have an artist-centered practice, I think that listening is a key and important facet at all times. Leading with artist perspectives, not curatorial or institutional agendas. Learning about contexts and histories. Engaging with artist processes and production. Prioritizing putting money into artists' hands. Creating collective impact models. Thinking generatively and working iteratively. And building community and belonging. In other words, embedding access into what it is that you're doing. So this is one of my hokey diagrams, because I'm terrible at doing them. I'm trying to show here what I think the basic common denominator is, if you think about what an artist-centered practice is, as an institution or somebody working within an institution. And so I would say that the 2 key aspects are that you're thinking about artist perspectives on the world and human relationships. And the frame around that is thinking through audiences, who it is that you're bringing to what the artists are thinking about and doing, and how to create that bridge. Thinking about contexts, place, location, political, social, and then thinking about the right types of facilitation, rather than thinking curatorially, thinking about facilitation and what that needs. And I just put a couple of notes here about what that might be. So being intentional about what emphasis to put on, for example, presentation versus production, when to present, when to support artists through production further. Research or discourse. Sometimes it's time to kind of talk out loud and to encourage artists to talk out loud about what they're thinking. Other times it's important to allow them to have time to do the research and to think behind closed doors. And that leads to the third point, which is, what is the relationship between making things public and creating space behind closed doors for people to kind of listen and learn to each other? So that's my first attempt at thinking about what constitutes the parameters for an artist-centered practice. And I'm sure many of you have got ideas as to what could be added or taken away from that. So I'm going to talk through 2 different contexts that I've worked in, one with Garage Museum of Contemporary Art and also with MoMA PS1. And I'm doing this not as a way to explain what I did and how I did it, but more to think through this lens of what is it to work within an institution and to try and create a context whereby artist-centered practice is the driving force. I'm not going to be talking about exhibitions. And I want everybody to know that it's not because I'm deprioritizing exhibitions, it's because of the fact that take it for read that there are hundreds and hundreds of exhibitions that went on. I'm thinking more programmatically and more around the kind of institutional structures and thinking that constitutes the kind of bigger whole of thinking institutionally. So with Garage, when I first started there, which was in 2013, it was called Garage Center for Contemporary Culture. And quite quickly, we turned it into Garage Museum of Contemporary Art in terms of phraseology. Partly because the word center in Russian and in this kind of context was seen as more elitist, and museum was something that people understood in general. And the context for Garage, no matter what kind of center it was or museum it was, is that it was the first kind of large-scale contemporary art space to be constructed within Moscow. And so it had a couple of different iterations. The version that you're seeing here is in Gorky Park. It's the last version so far of the museum, and maybe ever. But what was really important was to think about, again, the context. When audiences are new and aren't necessarily used to seeing contemporary art, how is it that you create a context for that? When there is no collection, and there can't really be a collection because contemporary art is something that didn't exist anywhere apart from the underground for a number of years up until the 1990s. How do you start to think about a museum? So the catchphrase, if you like, we said was, or I wrote as, Garage is a place for people, art, and ideas to create history. Thinking through the fact that basically it's artists' ideas, it's the way in which we come together that creates the history that constitutes how a museum can be built. And right from the beginning, I forefronted kind of letting audiences know that the programs were to introduce audiences to artists and their perspectives on the world. And this, particularly somewhere like Moscow, was really important. And we described that in doing this, it gave people agency to ask questions, access to knowledge, and a forum for public debate. And this is quite different to the kind of accessibility or the kind of freedom of thinking if we were to outline that the institution was more bureaucratic, or if we as the institution were giving the official voice. By enabling artists to speak, it gives more freedom for audiences to think around, because it's not the top-down approach. In the first few years in developing the program, we only developed group shows, and we did as many shows as possible that enabled audiences to get their head inside what it was to make art or to engage with art. So one of the projects that we did that's been going since the 90s was Hans-Ulrich Obrist's Do It. And this was something that had such a hugely resonant, it was hugely resonant in this kind of context. It went on for a number of months. It kept changing because people could come along and make the work themselves and participate in the work. And in this way, start to think through what it was to make art and think about art differently from just being the observer. Another way of thinking through centering artists was through the development of Garage Archive Collection. And this basically constituted still does constitute the collection of the museum. And this started in 2012, started building a number of different archives from different places, starting from the 1990s forwards, because as the explosion of contemporary art happened at the fall of the Soviet Union, there were a number of places like the Ullens Center, for example, who were in Moscow for a couple of years. There was much documentation of the avid action that was happening. And so it was a case of collecting that information and giving it like a place to be. The reason why this is important is because when you consider that there are very few artworks that are either left from the underground period or that even manifested as objects, because artists were basically meeting with each other, sharing their work through what were called albums, which are kind of like sketchbooks, but with kind of finished works through discussion. And so how is it that you start to base contemporary art culture that is grounded in somewhere like Russia when you don't necessarily have the material objects to be able to present to people? It's through the archives, it's through the evidence of their actions. And so there are many, many artist archives within this as well, video, all sorts of different types of materials. And when we first started thinking through how to use this as a kind of the heart, if you like, of the institution, we took the archive and we started inviting artists and others to work through what we thought to begin with was going to be a family tree of Russian contemporary art. In doing this, you can start to think about how you're going to be presenting artists in the museum. Which order do you do solo shows? How do you organize group shows? When you don't necessarily have a written art history of something because it's underground, how do you start to put order to what it is that you want to do, as a museum would traditionally do? What we discovered was that it ended up being a bush. This is an example of the bush. And what was fantastic about this process is that it became participatory. There's a number of different ways in which articles at the time or people's experiences at the time overlapped, disagreed with each other. And so through this, there can be a collective way of actually understanding the foundational practices of artists from which to build the rest of the museum. And then over, like, I think 3 years of first starting this, we then started developing RAAN, which is the Russian Art Archive Network, working closely with Bremen University and the Rutgers University, who both have archives that correlate to the period of basically from the 50s forwards of Russian and Soviet contemporary art, and starting to digitize. So it was possible for people within Russia who can't necessarily travel to start accessing their own art histories and to start finding information that they otherwise couldn't actually access, so that art histories could be written in Russia by Russians. So, let's just stop this. I'm going to show you a video. It's 3 minutes long, and it's basically something that I co-wrote with a couple of other staff, using footage from the archive to try and give you a sense of, one, the material in the archive and how it was used. So hopefully, when I press play, it's not going to move on to the next one. Let's see.
Russian and Soviet contemporary art is quite unexplored territory, both for local and international audiences. So Garage Museum of Contemporary Art is working to change this. One of the reasons the histories are unknown is that from the start of Stalin's purges in the 1930s and through subsequent political policies up to the late 1980s, art practice and exhibitions were only permitted as part of official state-sanctioned art. So-called unofficial artists, those who did not adhere to the glorification of communism, were given few opportunities to exhibit publicly. After the fall of the Iron Curtain in 1991, artists got their first chance since the avant-garde movement in the 1920s to become part of an international context, and that re-emergence has been difficult for many social and psychological reasons. The explosion of activity in Russian contemporary art in the early 1990s raised questions of its local heritage and the potential for its place in the broader art world.
In 2012, Garage founded an archive collection to address the lack of access to information. This is now the largest public resource in the world for unofficial Soviet and Russian contemporary art. We welcome local and international scholars to research at our library and archive center, as well as producing exhibitions and publications that reveal the little-known histories. Recognizing that history is always in the making, Garage is also the first institution to develop research across the country to what artists are currently producing, what they are thinking about, and what they find urgent. This is made public through Garage Triennial of Russian Contemporary Art, which was initiated in 2017, as well as through online projects, original exhibitions that accumulate materials from each city. In 2017, the museum also launched RAAN, the Russian Art Archive Network, which is established to ensure wide visibility for materials about underground Soviet and Russian art from the post-war period on. It is the first international network focused on creating an online catalog that centralizes materials from archives dispersed across the globe.
Through all these activities, Garage is a place where people, arts and ideas make history, offering fresh perspectives on social and cultural tendencies from a country that is largely unknown for contemporary art.
So one of the areas that Anton Belov, the male voice that you heard, that's the director of Garage. The female voice was Dasha Kortova, who is head of communications. So was the Russian Triennial of Contemporary Art, which was, as it said, started in 2017. And this was something that I wanted to develop because there are a number of curators working at Garage, all Russian, who were spending a lot of time thinking about artists that were working internationally and how to bring international voices into Moscow. But what I could understand was key was that Garage needed to be a place whereby voices of artists from across the country could actually be heard and work could be seen for the first time. So the Triennial basically enabled the curators to travel across the country and to meet with artists, to start building relationships and to select works that would be part of each triennial. So what you're seeing here with these dots are the places that the curators went to in the first round. There's 2 triennials that have happened so far. There's a large gap across the top, as you see. That is mostly because it's kind of tundra and they weren't researching into deer or other like icebergs or anything like that. They were definitely looking at like human artists in the first instance. There has been 2 triennials so far, one in 17, then in 2021. It should have been 2020 because of the pandemic. And now there are no more triennials in process because Garage has stopped making all exhibitions because of the war in Ukraine. So they've stopped all of that, that work. To look at another perspective that I was thinking through with the programming, with all the curatorial team, was to develop Garage field research, which is this is actually an ongoing program. There are around 23 projects that have happened so far. But it was basically an opportunity for artists to do research into little known events, philosophies, look into materials that they were interested in that they couldn't necessarily otherwise gain access to in Russia, and to develop work as a consequence of that could be shown or not shown. It was really trying to forefront, as part of the programming, the opportunity for artists to do research and the institution in its official position to be able to like help support them getting access to places that otherwise were very difficult to get into. So if you go onto the website, you can see more details on those. These are the first 3 projects, as I say, around 23 that have happened so far. So you can see that they were all quite different in terms of the interests that they had, from looking into the influence of the teachers that African and Arab filmmakers had in the 60s and 70s, to looking at the American National Exhibition in Moscow and Anton Vidok's Cosmism research, which started kind of in force doing this field research at Garage and has continued in many, many different ways, as I'm sure many of you have seen. So to kind of finish up with Garage, this is in 2018. This is a diagram of what was kind of happening. And this number 4 is the main building that things were happening in at the time. Number 3 next door to it was the second building that was going to be developed that is now on hold. Number 2 is the archive and library, which is now like been closed down, but all of the archive and library has been moved into number 4, which is the main museum, because there are no exhibitions. So now it's a cafe and access to the archives and library. And number one, which was the kind of incubator that was working between art, science, philosophy, has also been moved into 4 and is very limited. And then the one area that is kind of growing, if you like, is 6, which was just starting in 2018, which is the artist studios. Because at the moment, the garage is trying to support artists to be able to continue practicing in the current state of affairs, where there's very little left, and most men have left the country by now if they can. So to move on to PS1 and think through other ways of thinking through how to create kind of artist-centered practices institutionally. When I was being interviewed for the job at PS1, it took 9 months and 7 interviews. And this was actually a really good experience, because by the end of that period, the framework for the vision that I had for PS1 was basically agreed upon with all the people that I was interviewing with. And that basically is a framework that hasn't changed to this day for the entirety of my tenure. And so it was a extremely kind of useful process to go through. And when I started, well, actually, I should step back. It's like during the interview, it was very clear. MoMA, after having a relationship for 20 years with PS1, the question was, what should the relationship between MoMA and PS1 be? And this was for a number of reasons. One, it's always important to keep updating a relationship, especially when it's between an experimental institution and the biggest museum of modern art in the world. But 2, the Museum of Modern Art, you'll remember back in like the fall of 2019, was opening its new buildings. So it was the new MoMA as it was being phrased. So the whole question was, what is the new PS1? What is the relationship between MoMA and PS1? MoMA at that time was developing the new performance space. In the 20 years that PS1 and MoMA have had the affiliation, MoMA went from having curators that were mostly specialized in modern to pretty much all the chief curators and the curators having a specialism in contemporary. And there were many ways in which MoMA, like through the changing collections, through the commissioning processes and the projects and the rotating collections, had really started to, if you like, embrace and embed within the institution some of the experimentation that had been learned from and tested out at PS1. So then what should PS1 be now? PS1, on the other hand, went from being an institution that was basically in an industrial enclave to an institution, it's in the kind of red circle within that picture, an institution that was part of the fastest growing neighborhood in the United States of America. So one of the key aspects of thinking about what the relationship between the two should be was thinking about a collective impact model. PS1 is an institution that is city-owned. The building is city-owned. And also it is an affiliate with MoMA. And these are 2 extremely powerful organizations. And PS1 has the privilege of having like large resources available to it in comparison to many other scrappy nonprofits. And so how is it possible to start to create a collective impact model, i.e. create experimental institutionality or institutional experimentation that can benefit artists? That was one of the first parts of thinking through the vision. This was based on the fact that the history of PS1, as you will, I think, I can't see who's on the call, but as many of you know, Alana Heiss, who founded PS1, was very artist-centered, and the entire kind of construct for PS1 was for artists to experiment in. It was, as I say, in this industrial enclave. It was off the beaten track. The audience wasn't the center. It was a place for artists to really experiment. The building was dilapidated. The first exhibition, artists just took over the rooms and tested out ideas. So there were artist studios there from the very beginning, even when there wasn't power. So this foundation of this kind of experimental artist-centered place was already the foundation of PS1. There's also the second skin of PS1, as I think of it, which is that whilst it doesn't have a collection, there's evidence that artists have been there everywhere. So there are many, many works that artists, or the residues of works, but in pretty good nick, in the stairwells. This is Lawrence Wiener's piece, A Bit of Matter and a Little Bit More, on the door as you enter. So there's this kind of second skin that when you walk into the building, you can feel that artists are present. And then there was this history of Sunday sessions, or it used to be Saturday sessions or sessions, which is where artists were able to build allegiances and talk about issues and questions and like basically discuss whatever it is that they wanted to do. And again, in a situation that wasn't massively public. It was open to the public, but that wasn't the priority. It was very much about how to have these conversations around the urgencies that they really felt. So these were some of the kind of foundational elements in a nutshell that were making PS1. What had started to happen was what I would call a kind of festival culture. So PS1 was increasingly based on a festival culture. And by that, I mean, it was a platform rather than a place. So for 20 years, Warm Up was extremely, extremely popular, building and gaining momentum, you can see on the left, and the Young Architects project, which is the structure behind, were events that happened the same time every year. They happened simultaneously. It was a moment to go to PS1, but what I discovered is that you wouldn't necessarily go back to PS1 throughout the year. The New York Art Book Fair with Printed Matter was an incredibly, incredibly popular event where pretty much the entirety of the building was emptied out of exhibitions and the book fair would come in. So what you had was with this kind of festival culture was that there wasn't necessarily the continuity of how the building would work on an everyday basis. When you arrived for these things, it was for these things. And with something like YAP, for example, the Young Architects project, when you look at this image, it kind of explains to you, it's like when before the massive gentrification and the rebuilding of Long Island City, doing an architect's project that would be there for 3 months and then disappear made total sense. It's a great place for artists to experiment. But then when you're living there and everywhere around you is basically an architectural experiment and constantly going up and down, then it doesn't necessarily have the same resonance. So it was thinking through these various facets where PS1 had been serving and still serves artists in a certain way, but how does it need to be adapted because of its context? So when I started, I spoke to every staff member and asked them what the core values of MoMA PS1 were from their perspective. Spent half an hour with each person and also asked them advice to a new director. And this is a kind of summary that I presented to the board. And what's interesting about this is that without fail, artist-centric, or words to that extent, like being led by artists at the center was pretty much the overriding thing that staff would say as what makes PS1 PS1. When I did the same thing with the board and started to, I did 2 board retreats before the pandemic hit, the same thing. Artist-centric was and again, different words to name that, was the thing that was the kind of central and driving force as to what they thought made PS1 PS1 and what they thought was important to take into the future. And so this was the first diagram that we kind of made together, if you like, to create the direction of PS1 as naming it as an artist-centered place, naming it to ourselves internally. So the first priority is artist-centered, community-driven, community being artists and their communities, the community of board and staff, the immediate community around it, driven by what these immediate communities thought was important, and then emerging international networks, international meaning the kind of local international as much as the over there international, building staffing structure and building board engagement. So this was kind of the structure or the framework that we had before the pandemic hit. And then when the pandemic hit, so this was basically all done between September and March, September 19 to March 20. So when the pandemic hit, we were kind of faced with a new issue, if you like, which is, of course, all of us were having to go online. We had this site that nobody could get into. And PS1 was in the situation whereby there was no real online presence because PS1 didn't have its own website. It had a presence within MoMA's website, which was much more informational. But when it comes to wanting to communicate to your audiences, basically Instagram was our way of communicating. And what we know at the time during the pandemic, if you are committed to being artist-centered, was that you have some key issues. You have the fact that we need to put money into artists' hands. There was very few ways that they were able to earn money. We need to stop the isolation and build connectivity, and we need to support them in the ways that they were supporting their communities. So we unearthed an old Tumblr, and we started doing these various projects and programs. These are on the side, you can see some of the kind of themes of the way that we will be working, all of which moved as much of what money remained after the collapse during the pandemic into artists' hands for doing various different conversations, dialogues, care packages, mutual aid. And this basically is what I think with many institutions helped us understand that we had to start thinking online and on site from that moment on. Which meant from that moment on, we started developing what has now become PS1's website. So now there is an independent website, and the way that it is developed is again using this kind of whole thinking around artist-centered at its core. So what it tries to do, again, feedback welcome to PS1, is to flatten the hierarchies of what kind of program it is within PS1, and instead focus on artist perspectives and the way that they see the world. So for an online viewer, it's not important whether it's an exhibition or if it's an interview or if it's a public program, because you're seeing it all within this one medium, which is the online website. And so when you scroll it, and I haven't managed to do an animated version, when you start scrolling, you are faced much more with like things that you might want to tap into, similar to a kind of Instagram or social media scroll, where you then pick up on topics that might be interesting to you and start looking through what's happening. So it's literally centering artists and their ideas rather than centering the kind of hierarchies, as I say, of the types of programs. And then, of course, you can go and look at it differently if you want to, if you actually want to go and visit. We also started thinking about the building and like what it's, how you need to start thinking about the context and the site in relation to this artist-centeredness. So Karai Duman, who's an architect, he runs BKD in New York, actually came to us and said, I'll work with you pro bono because I have the PPP and I want to keep my staff engaged. How can I help you? So together with the team, we started thinking through the uses of the building and what needed to happen to it for the new PS1. Take note of this like long wall on Jackson Avenue at the front, that great long stretch at the bottom. If I can, this. And so we started thinking through how to actually kind of break up the uses of PS1 to create different speeds and different ways of programming. So still maintaining a large amount of the building for exhibitions. But as you know, if you visited PS1, there's an awful lot of space to walk around if you've only got an hour and a half. And if you want to hang out, then you don't necessarily want to see another exhibition. You want to maybe hang out in a different way. So starting to think about how to divide the space into artist studios again, into flex spaces that could be for meetings, for performances, for different gatherings, thinking through the courtyard and its uses, and in particular thinking about this wall that's along Jackson Street, because without fail, when you speak to artists, when you speak to staff, when you speak to the neighbors, this was the big thing that is dividing PS1 from its neighborhood. It used to be to protect PS1, and now it's basically blocking from the neighborhood. So in the process of doing this, we managed to get $9 million from the city, which is still there to be able to develop how to actually like physically make the building more porous. With the artist studios, we know that having studios somewhere like PS1 isn't necessarily, it doesn't need to be thought of as an artist residency in the same way. So in talking to artists, how do you provide studios for people who are doing projects there or who need them on a temporary basis in relation to what's happening at PS1 or projects that they're doing in relation to, I don't know, different ideas that have come out of what they were doing at PS1. So there's rotating opportunities to work in studios. And there's also a way in which artists were brought into the rethinking of how these spaces needs to be constituted. So when you think back to that map of the building, what are the uses of the courtyard that are necessary? How do the spaces in their flexibility need to be used? You know, let's speak to artists, let's speak to activists, to organizers, to designers, to neighbors, and start thinking about what, you know, if we're really talking about centering it on what artists need, let them tell us. So there was a 2-year project that started exploring this in different ways. And what you're looking at is one part of a space that's now called homeroom, which is basically, if you like, the kind of internal space of questioning and connectivity. And it connects into the courtyard, and then the little triangle in the front of PS1, which is the plaza, that now is developed in collaboration with the Department of Transport for public use in various ways. And so in thinking through, again, when you're thinking about artist-centered, like which artists are centered and how, the connectivity between different facets of programming bring up different artists that you might want to start developing relationships with. For example, Marking Time, Art in the Age of Mass Incarceration was an exhibition that happened, and through that, we started meeting other artists, and in particular started working with Fortune Society, this organization that works with creatives who are returning home. And so from there, it was possible to start working with Fortune Society artists to develop their own projects and bring in their own communities. And then they started working in other parts of the building, and there are still ongoing projects and different ways of working with them alongside artists from Marking Time, kind of focusing on mass incarceration much more broadly. Same thing with Queen Jean, and thinking through the issues of, I mean, this is working with Black trans liberation, the issues of the number of trans people who were killed during the pandemic, basically, responding to a lot of the issues that were coming out of Sunday sessions that artists felt were important in that moment. In the courtyard, trying to find a way of creating a commissioning process. How can we put money into artists' hands to create works that can be generative within the courtyard? So the first project was with Rashid Johnson, who made the stage that has just come down, but for 2 years was basically providing a platform for people to be able to develop their own events, step up to the stage and speak their mind. It worked in many, many different ways, and as a platform that connected into other parts of the programming. Of course, then there were other, like you might remember the Nikki DeSanfel fountain. There was the Greg Borderwitz AIDS is just beginning. The AIDS pandemic is just beginning. And so trying to find ways of putting artists' voices into the courtyard. So when you walk in, rather than it just being a bunch of concrete walls and gravel, how are you meeting this plurality of ideas immediately as you walk in? And then thinking through how artists can start to shift and change some of the traditions that are really important to PS1, but maybe the models need to be kind of updated or rethought. So for example, with Warm Up, we can continue doing Warm Up, but what about other types of music festivals? So in working with this artist called Jali Cepeda Brown, who did a homeroom project based around a lot of work that she does around excluded workers. She was making a film basically during the pandemic. So there was a homeroom space that was looking at what was happening with a number of different organizations that then also turned into this big music festival and event that happened in both the plaza and the courtyard and inside the building. It's a one-off that may continue. It's not about setting precedents for what needs to be like ongoing programs. It's about opening things up to see when you bring artists into your midst, who are the communities that they then start to bring in the other artists that they start working with to create something that is kind of generative, that comes out of issues that they know are really important, that resonate with other communities that you are basically existing within as an institution. So you see this Artists Make New York on the wall, which this basically replaced the logo of MoMA PS1 at the time of Greater New York, so last September. And this again was a way of basically stating an institution's intention rather than showing the public the logo or your brand. So it's like, what is it to actually like make a statement to a public instead of like name yourself? So that's like, again, walls are a kind of theme, like breaking down the walls and these kinds of physical and psychological barriers. How do you start to like do that within the context? And Greater New York was a important thinking around, again, another facet of this artist-centered practice, because as many of you, I think, know, Greater New York is an exhibition that's been running over the last 20 years, every 5 years, and it explores practices that are happening in the New York boroughs. And so this was under development again, but partly because of the pandemic and partly in response to what we were hearing from many artists, we reduced down the number of artists in Greater New York quite dramatically. There were over 100 artists in the last Greater New York, and in this one there was 47. Again, thinking about how to put more money into artists' hands, how to support them as they were making work, when many artists lost their incomes to be able to make work during the pandemic. It doesn't necessarily give opportunities for hundreds of artists to show, but again, through this generative thinking about what can come out of it in other ways with artists later, how do you start to really support the artists that you are working with rather than just present? And then also, how do you start to take something like Greater New York as an impetus, as something that's really important, but rather than thinking about New York artists, again, as a kind of festival every 5 years, let's celebrate them. What if you celebrate artists in New York all day, every day? So trying to make that kind of shift. And so to kind of, I've got 2 more slides here, to think again about the walls. I talked to you about the wall along Jackson Avenue, the big concrete wall that is now seen as a kind of divide rather than a safe, making PS1 safe. This, of course, will take time to change. It's working with the city. It's a city-owned wall. They have agreed to develop this, but the bureaucracies are there. So the way that we started thinking about how to make the building more porous and this wall more porous, again, is working with artists and letting artists lead the way in how they want to think about this porosity. So I have a video here, which is like 4 minutes, where I'm gonna let Nani speak for herself and her co-creators on this project.
This project and all of the portraits that we plan to create are really a way to establish people who are making on the ground difference in their community, for the people, by the people, and bring those people to be recognized in their space and in their landscapes. Hi, I'm Nani Chacon. I'm from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and the Navajo Nation. I'm an artist, muralist, and a painter, and I'm here at PS1. I began art as a graffiti artist, making work in Albuquerque, and it really informed my relationship with the way that I saw myself in landscapes, the way that I saw people interact with landscapes, and the agency also that I had as a young woman to take up space in landscapes. I first started coming to New York about 20 years ago. And I remember the first time that I came out here, it was almost like my brain couldn't comprehend how linear everything was, because I was so used to this like far stretching organic landscape. And the other thing that I remember immediately feeling when coming to New York was just that the city had a soul. It felt very old, and you could really feel the transference of people moving in and out of it, from indigenous people to immigrants to people now. And especially, I feel like I have come back over the years because it's a place that artists need to work in, that artists do work in, and that we are seen in. After the Fire is a community engaged project, and working with Laikwa and Tatiana was pretty amazing. We partook in this project really as a way to begin discourse about the pressing issues that we were facing at the time, coming out of the pandemic, coming out of a lot of social turbulence and change, and really wanting to know what happens next. And it started as an internal investigation and then was open up to community members in this area, using the opportunity for the wall itself to interact as dialogue, but also to act as a bridge, bringing people who were already on the grounds, already making impacts in their communities, already thinking along those lines, whether it was through immigrant rights or whether it was just acknowledging and sustaining the relationships that had already taken place on this land for centuries. We worked with Transform America, that was a self-organized mutual aid effort out of Queensbridge Projects. We also worked with Make the Road, which is an immigrant advocacy and social rights group. And we worked with Shinnecock, Matinecock Nations, original inhabitants of this area, into Queens and Long Island. And the person in the mural is Kelly Dennis. Kelly Dennis is one of the members of Shinnecock Nation and partook in this project because she is a new leader within her tribal council. And for a young woman to take part in that role, it really is a symbol of change, bringing in points of view that are really the counter to colonial patriarchy. In our personal conversation and discourse with these groups, the thing that was most striking and kind of, I think, that was really binding in a lot of ways and wasn't anything that, of course, we planned for, was this idea of audacious dreaming. And this idea of moving forward is that we as people have this feeling and need to move forward no matter what we faced in the past.
So this is the last project I'll talk about in relation to this, because there was this other desire that it didn't matter who you spoke to, artists, people in the neighborhood, through this Courtyard Coalition and all the conversations that were had, there's a desire for the courtyard at PS1 to become a garden. But how do you do that? How do you start to learn how you can grow stuff together? Can you actually make it survive? And what kind of garden and where? So again, by turning to artists and what they do, we started this experiment, which is still happening now. And this is a project called Growing Abolition by an artist called Jackie Sumel, in collaboration with the Lower East Side Girls Club and a whole load of different gardening collectives and other people who wanted to kind of participate in it. And the greenhouse is the size of a solitary confinement cell. Again, trying to find threads of how various artists that you meet along the way as you're dealing with issues that are urgent for our time? How do you start to kind of spread the way in which we can have different perspectives on these issues? And so this greenhouse is the size of a solitary confinement cell. And the initial idea came out of work that Jackie Summel was doing with 3 men who became known as the Angola 3, who were in solitary confinement for between 60 and 40 years. And Herman Wallace in particular, who she worked with for 12 years to develop this idea. And then at PS1, you can't read it because it's too small on Zoom, of course, but like on the bottom right, this is plantings, for example, by the North Bronx Collective, which started in 2020. There were a group of people who really wanted to start to think about bringing back land to Indigenous people in the Bronx. They started a small garden and then were locked out of it. And so they came and joined this project, a number of different organizations like that. So this is a kind of pilot that's developed by an artist with their communities to start thinking through something that can become something bigger, which is how do you grow in PS1? So it's kind of thinking in that way around issues and ideas. So I left PS1 in July, and I just want to say, like, since then, a couple of different ways that I'm kind of thinking through this artist-centeredness in quite different ways is there's one project that I'm working on at the moment with the Tamayo Museum in Mexico City, which is a 2-part exhibition and a conference, thinking through what it is to be building a collection, I'm working with a collection there that is all started by an artist, Rufino Tamayo, who's the person that founded the museum in 1981, insistently wanting it to be an international museum in Mexico City. And the collection predominantly is one that he has built himself, exchanging with artists or using the money from his own work to buy other artists' work. And then since the 1990s has grown in various different ways, but much more sporadically. So thinking through that and what it is to understand this kind of artist-centeredness through a collection that has been built through an artist and his networks. And then I'm also working with Jesse Crimes in the middle with the pink pants. Do you call them pants if they're short? I'd call them shorts. And Russell Craig, who is to his left, who are 2 artists, formerly incarcerated artists, who 6 years ago set up a fellowship called Right of Return. And every year there are 6 artists who are given funds to develop a project, working in relation to activists and ideas that are still urgent around the carceral state and issues around mass incarceration. And basically what they have got to the stage where this is gaining in interest, and they are setting up, rather than this being a fellowship program that is supported by another institution, SOSE is the institution, like SOSE agency is supporting the Right of Return. They are in the process of setting up a nonprofit called the Art and Advocacy Society. So this is a nonprofit that will be artist-led for other artists. And so what I'm doing is I'm working with them to help them think through the structures of how this nonprofit needs to be set up, what kind of staffing is needed, what kind of thinking programmatically and how to present it to a broader public. So in other words, like trying to put my skills and talents into something that is like being developed by artists. And so I'll just finish on like a kind of thought and an observation that I've been having of late, which is that we are, when we look around us, partly because of the some of the wealth that is moving into artists' hands because of the commercial art world, which, you know, to a certain extent, you could say is extremely artist-centered because they spend all day, every day servicing artists rather than thinking of exhibitions or like in the way that exhibitions and programming in the way that other institutions do. But what we've seen over the last 10 years or so is artists setting up their own nonprofits in a number of different ways. If you think about Theaster Gates, if you think about Julie Moretu with Denniston Hill, if you think about Titus Kaffar with Next Haven, further afield, Ibrahim Mahama in Ghana, setting up an art space, or Sami Baloji setting up the Congo Biennial in Congo. It's like there's an interesting development that's happening whereby artists are using their own resources to set up systems that are looking at the urgencies that they think are important, but for other artists as well. And so I'm very interested in thinking through what that actually means in terms of the future of our institutions and our practices. So I will end there and unshare my screen.
Great, thanks so much, Kate. Time for questions, and I'm sure that Brian has a question. He was pressured to have one, but before he speaks, there was already one in chat. So Kate, if you'll look there.
CMU School of Art to everyone.
Yes.
You talked about flattening the hierarchies.
Right.
Production online with PS1's website, that lectures and public programs hold the same weight as exhibitions. Can you talk more about these hierarchies and how they manifest in institutions, and why it's important to dismantle them in order to be artist-centered? Yes. So traditionally in public institutions, there is a kind of order of things in terms of how the money gets spent and the emphasis on communications and development. And this is all around the fact that exhibitions are the kind of priority. And I'm not anti-exhibitions, but there is a way in which, if you start thinking about how artists work, not every artist who works in a museum is necessarily given the giant exhibition space. There are ways in which it's important to either do group shows or to do solo shows with artists who need that kind of space. But there are other artists who traditionally may have been put in the kind of education or public programs. So how do we start to shift this hierarchy? Because when you think about the ideas that artists are giving us so that we can see the world differently, is it always that everything has to be through an object in space? Could it be that equally importantly are films or discussions or performances? Or so rather than thinking spatially in terms of how much room something takes up in terms of importance, it's the ideas and how we manifest them. So the website is a very interesting way to be able to flatten those hierarchies, because the website is not an exhibition space. It's not, you know, a building. So how can it run parallel and really start to expand this kind of notion in a different format? Does that make sense?
Excuse me. Could I jump in with a question here? There are a few more coming in. I was wondering, Kate, if you have observed any kind of really consistent and continuous methods for being artist-centered, because I think one of them, it seems very clear in all of your work, is incredible kind of sensitivity and receptiveness to the context and to the conditions, and then building those into the institution. But I wonder if you've observed any other kind of strategies or practices that have been really consistent throughout all of these different conditions that you've worked in.
That's what I was trying to do with these foundational ideas. It's like, I think that there's throughout, no matter like how you do it, and there are many different ways. I'd love to hear some different ways that other people in the audience have been thinking through this. It's like, but listening, starting off by listening rather than like speaking, and leading with what it is that you hear and what artists are actually interested in, rather than something that I think is easy to slip into, but something I think is not a good idea, is leading with curatorial agendas or with institutional agendas. For example, I know that wall needs to come down, outside PS1 when I'm working there. It's like, it's just so obvious with the way that everybody's speaking that it's like the wall needs to come down. It's like there are so many different ways you can approach how to take that wall down. And so like, how do you, instead of like taking the institutional agenda, how do you turn to artists? And when you listen to what Nani said and the ways in which they understood the wall and what the wall could actually represent before it came down, then you learn something completely different and it becomes much richer. So it's like, you know, so as I say, those foundational ideas, the collective impact, I think is another one, the idea of generative practices, how more people can benefit if you work in different ways, if you put money into different, if you basically take money from one place and put it into another, if you're putting money into artists' hands as often as possible, how does that then start to generate something completely different?
Great. So there are two questions, Kate, one from Emily and then Margarita in chat.
There's also one from Wasan. Where's the Emily in that? Do you want me to read them out?
Yes, and Wasan. Everybody can see them in chat, so you can just jump in.
So Emily, thank you for your many ideas and reflections on working with contemporary artists, especially from within institutions. Do you have any thoughts on if and how one can work in an artist-centric way when dealing with work by artists who have passed away? Yes. And it's a really good question. I've done it a number of times. It's of course harder, but there is always a trail. There is always the archive. There is always conversations that artist has had with other people. There is always rather than kind of trying to take one lens onto that artist, it's like by creating more of a kind of kaleidoscope of different perspectives, then it's easier to start to enable the artist to have a wobble and to be kind of multifaceted rather than just understood through the work that you're looking at in the first instance, for example. Does that make sense? Is Emily allowed to speak, or are they all silenced?
Absolutely. Emily, you can jump on if you'd like.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much for your answer.
So Margarita. This is a long question. So Garage, how much artistic freedom does an artist have in Moscow? Margarita, do you want to choose one of these questions? And then if we have time, we'll come back. Which question would you like?
Yes, maybe I will choose the last one. The last one is about working with artists at risk.
Mm-hmm.
And at the present time, many organizations in Ukraine have transformed themselves into shelters.
Mm-hmm.
We are also in the process of transforming our own space into a shelter. And that raises a lot of questions which we don't know exactly how to approach. And I was wondering, what would you do if you would need to transform PS1 into a shelter?
Very good question. I am somebody that would not turn PS1 into a shelter, but I would do my damnedest to find other places that are more suitable shelters. PS1 does not have enough toilets. It doesn't have enough facilities. It's like, I'm somebody that really believes that artists can lead initiatives, and also people who are like really wanting to make sure, you know, that the urgencies of our time are catered for. But recognizing what skills we have and what we're good at in various places. For example, within an institution, we can be good at listening and understanding the world in different ways. We can be good at fundraising. We can be good at communicating, but we're not necessarily good at giving mental health or physical health or facilities that are actually livable. Because an awful lot of museums are very unlivable, even if they're very up to date. And so it's how do we use our skills to find those shelters, to create those shelters, to create the networks that make those shelters possible, so that we actually engage more of the communities around us and get them to understand what it is that we're trying to think about and do from what we've learned. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. But when listening to artists, and I'm working with a lot of them from Ukraine at this moment, the only answer I get from them is, we need shelter for the winter. So, and also they came up with a series of interventions we could actually do in the space to transform, because they are artists, so they know how to transform the space, and they have gone through this experience of war, and other institutions in Ukraine that have made the same adaptations. So they design pieces that will resolve the issues of a cultural center not being truly livable as a shelter. Well, but yes, thank you for your input anyways. Very urgent question. I'm looking forward to find an answer.
Is this your space?
Yes.
Yeah, so it'd be interesting. It's this beautiful space, but it's like, it'll be interesting to see how artists actually come up with making that livable. Like, I think it looks like a beautiful space, and it's incredible what you're doing in terms of like trying to be as responsive as possible.
Thank you.
So there are two, we're running out of time. Maybe you could answer Wassan and Carolyn, and we'll call it a night.
Sounds good. Wassan says, much of this type of work you discussed requires time. It moves at its own pace, and the work takes shape in its own terms. This often creates friction with the institution, which function within right timelines and fundraising deadlines and all the other processes. How can institutions create better environments to host and support these programs? Wassan, very good question again. I think that you are absolutely correct. This is why somewhere like PS1, it was possible to test these ideas out through this kind of institutional experimentation rather than putting the experimentation on artists all the time. And I think some of the ways of looking at this is in line with how trusts and foundations and a number of philanthropists are actually thinking about how to shift the way that they support artists. Because traditionally you would raise money for an exhibition, which is why, again, exhibitions had so much importance. But if you can actually think programmatically and think of threads that move through what's going on within your programming, then it's possible to find people who are interested in that thread of interest and try to get money that's multi-year or incremental around a certain topic that can kind of build momentum, rather than the kind of stop-start process of fundraising via the exhibitions. So I definitely think that like creating better environments is super important, and it's early days. I think that it's very, very difficult in different situations to do this. I do think it's something that is like important to do moving into the future. And then Caroline, Wassan, is that okay? Anything else that is needed for?
No, that's great. Thank you so much. That's really thoughtful response.
And then Caroline Taylor, how does a collective impact model affect museum staff and those who may interact with the institution as freelance contract workers? Also, has there been any discussion in opening the interior courtyard as a public plaza that is always open? Part one, the way collective impact model affects museum staff is that they are more integrated into the way of thinking what impact is and how impact is made. It's a really good question that you ask, because if you're going to work like this, everybody from the people who are running the operations of the building, to the visitor engagement, to the trustees, to the curatorial staff, to the development staff, to the accountants, are all basically integral to understanding what motivates the institution moving forward, which is artists' ideas and their perspectives on the world and human relationships. And when you're thinking about a collective impact model, you are taking what the assets are of an institution. In PS1's case, it is the affiliation with MoMA, giving it kind of kudos and credence in one way, the city giving it kudos and credence in another way, both of them funding at the time when I left around $850,000 each, going in as the kind of core budget to build on top of. It's a great foundation to have. But then how do you start to move that money into the staff's hat? Like, how do you start to create equity within the staff and like into artists' hands so that then more people actually benefit from that funding? So the collective impact model is actually the model that enables you to think through that. And then, has there been any discussion in opening the interior courtyard as a public plaza that is always open? Yes, a lot. The idea is, let's see what happens in the future, but the idea is with the funding from the city that it would be possible to actually have that part, the courtyard open. It could be 24/7, it could be 10, daylight hours, whatever was kind of decided, with the cafe being opened, and actually with the whole of that side of the building. And then with the more high level insurance exhibitions that require more staffing, that would be museum hours. And then the rest of the building could be much more open, and the courtyard 100% as a public plaza. And again, looking at what that actually is and what is needed within that neighborhood, because there's different types of plazas. That's what the test was with the triangle that we grandly called a plaza on the outside, and like starting to develop how that's going to work. Does that help, Caroline?
Yeah, it does. I wonder if we have time for one more question.
Sure, go ahead, Caroline.
Perfect. Do you, this might be a really big question, but if the institution wasn't associated to MoMA, obviously they'd lose a lot of funding. But do you think it'd be possible to have like a different relationship to the neighborhood? There's like a lot of baggage with MoMA. There is a lot of baggage with MoMA as an institution, and I feel like there's always a little tension in between PS1's initiative, especially this collective impact you've just discussed, like giving money to the spreading money differently through an institution doesn't, to me, seem in line with like MoMA's methods. So yeah, just thinking about that tension between the institutions.
I think, again, if you look at the city and you look at MoMA, if you took one of those away, you wouldn't be looking at the same collective impact model at all. And for me, it's always been important to understand, like, what is it to create the reason why PS1 is able to be experimental. Remember when PS1 became part of MoMA, it was because of the fact that it was financially in a lot of trouble. There's ways now that it's grown up and it needs to create its own financial independence, and it is. But still, these affiliations between the city and MoMA actually create this incredibly different structure that another nonprofit doesn't have. If PS1 was just another nonprofit, I don't think it would change its relationship to the community insofar as it wouldn't necessarily bring something different. I think that there are already in Long Island City and in New York, many, many different nonprofit institutions that already bring that. So the difference that PS1 has the potential to bring because of the potential for this kind of collective impact model is the key. So you can't kind of do it without having the like thinking through the issues and how you actually like work with them productively. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you for your answer.
Great. Kate, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kate.
On that note, we will end. I'll just announce November 16th, our next talk will be with Sarah Raza on her new book called Punk Orientalism. And then in December, we'll launch a new series of talks under the title, The Algorithmic State. So we will be sending out word about that soon. And with that, good night to all. Thanks so much again, Kate.
Thank you.